Welcome to the presence of God, from Genesis to Revelation, a love story. Genesis 3:15 says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. She shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." God's plan of redemption is spelled out in the names of Adam's children and foreshadowed throughout the Torah. God created Adam, which is human, and Eve to be in fellowship with him. Unfortunately, sin destroyed that sweet communion. However, God had a plan that will take centuries to complete. In one of the most heartbreaking and joyous moments in Genesis, God has Abraham bring his promised son Isaac to a mountain in the land of Moriah to be sacrificed to God. This may be what later became called Mount Zion, the location of the temple in Jerusalem. Isaac is old enough to know what was happening and trusted his father and God enough that he does not fight being put upon the altar of sacrifice. The angel of the Lord calls out from heaven and interrupts Abraham just as he's about to strike Isaac with the death blow and says, "Stop! Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And Abraham looked up, and there was a ram in a thicket caught by his horns, which became the sacrifice upon the altar they had built. Another foreshadowing of God's deliverance. A son will be sacrificed, God's son. In the book of Exodus, we meet a remarkable figure named Moses. There are many parallels in his life to the life of Jesus. They are both born at a time when the ruling monarch was seeking to kill newborn Hebrew males. They were both rejected by the ones they were sent to save. And they both performed miraculous signs and wonders. Moses parting the Red Sea, Jesus calming the sea. They both experienced death as part of opening the door to the promised land or the promised rest. Through Moses, God begins to teach the Hebrews what had been lost during the many years since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They lost the meaning of his holiness, his presence. First, God appears to Moses as a burning bush that is not consumed. Then, God's presence is seen as a fiery cloud over Mount Sinai. God has come down to meet with Moses. Later, God's presence comes down the mountain and into the Holy of Holies. The tabernacle. There was only one way into the tabernacle, and only the Levitical priests were allowed to enter. The Holy of Holies also had only one entrance, and that could only be entered by the high priest once per year, after the sacrificial offerings and cleansings had been performed. In the books after the Pentateuch, we learn that Solomon built a temple around the Holy of Holies so that the presence of God would be in a house of brick and mortar. And later we hear Jesus say, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." In Numbers, we read the census of fighting age men. We get a record or account for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then we read about the instructions for how the people were to set up their camp whenever they were not on the move. The instructions are very specific. They state which tribes are to be together and in what order. The entire layout starts with the placement of the Holy of Holies, and around that is the tent of meeting, and around that are the Levitical priests and their families. Now, the language is specific, saying who is to locate on the north, the south, the west, and the east sides of the tent of meeting. It also says what direction the tent of meeting is to face. So, if we assume that each soldier represents a family unit, which would camp in roughly the same square area, and if we take the literal definition of north, south, east, and west, meaning no one camps northeast or northwest of the tent, then when you arrange all of the people in the order and manner written, if you were to climb to a high point like a mountain, and look down on the encampment, what would you see? You would see a cross. At the center of the cross, you would find the Holy of Holies, the presence of God. Over 1,430 years later, the world would witness another cross. On that cross, the presence of God, Christ Jesus, would be hung over the center. Yes, God did come down to deliver his people, and he was rejected, despised, and crucified. What a marvelous God, who knew what would happen and still willingly, like Isaac, allowed himself to be placed upon the altar, the cross of sacrifice, and in dying would say, "It is finished." Today we know the tabernacle is no longer made of brick and mortar. It's within us. It's within us as we receive the grace of Christ and become a new creation. This is Pastor Eric Bruning, and thank you for watching this teaching about God's love story from Genesis to Revelation.